Carl Jung once suggested that the most important changes in the psyche do not announce themselves loudly, but arrive as something much quieter, almost imperceptible at first. And if you have found yourself here, there is a strong possibility that you are already inside one of those moments. Something in you has gone silent in a way that feels unfamiliar, not peaceful, not resolved, but different. And this difference is not something you created consciously. It is something that has been forming beneath your awareness for a long time. What makes this moment so significant is not only that you can feel the shift, but that others can feel it too, even if they do not understand it. They notice that something about you no longer responds in the same way. The emotional patterns that once defined your presence are no longer automatic, and what they are reacting to is not distance. It is the beginning of a structural change inside you, one that cannot simply return to what it was before. To understand this, we have to return to something much earlier than any current relationship. Jung described the psyche not as a fixed identity, but as a living system shaped by forces, many of which remain outside awareness. These forces organize themselves around survival, not only in the physical sense, but in the emotional sense of belonging, of being held within a human environment. A child does not analyze this. A child adapts completely. If love requires sensitivity, the child becomes sensitive. If love requires silence, the child becomes silent. If love requires emotional labor, the child becomes the one who carries. This adaptation is not chosen. It is formed. And because it is formed so early, it becomes invisible to the person living inside it. Imagine a small moment from childhood. You are sitting at a table. Something feels off. No one is speaking. The atmosphere itself carries tension. You feel it before you understand it. And without knowing that you're doing anything significant, you begin to respond. You speak. You soften the room. You bridge the silence. And it works, at least partially. The tension shifts. The emotional weight lightens. And in that moment, something is learned at a level deeper than thought. Your sensitivity has value. Your ability to respond emotionally creates connection. And so a pathway forms quietly, repeatedly, until it becomes part of the architecture of who you are. A structure built not from preference, but from necessity. This is what Jung referred to when he spoke of complexes, not simply emotional wounds, but organized systems of feeling and perception rooted in early experience. The mother complex in this configuration often centers around a silent equation. Being needed feels like being loved, not as a conscious belief, but as a felt reality. When someone turns to you in distress, something activates in your body that resembles warmth, purpose, even intimacy. And so the movement toward others becomes automatic. Not because you decide to care, but because caring has been fused with your sense of existence itself. The father complex, by contrast, often encodes something more subtle but equally powerful. Your right to exist as a separate self, your right to take up space, to have needs that are not justified by usefulness, and in many cases, that right was never fully confirmed. Instead, it was negotiated quietly, beneath awareness, leaving behind a person who feels thoughtful, considerate, and deeply attuned, but uncertain at the deepest level about their own authority. You may recognize this in a familiar scene. You're speaking with someone important to you. There is something you need to express, something true. You begin to say it, and before you finish, You feel a shift in them, not in their words, but in their energy, a tightening, a withdrawal, and instantly something inside you adjusts. You soften your message, you qualify it, you reshape it in real time so that it will land more gently. And by the end of the conversation, you have spoken, but not fully. Something true remains unexpressed. This is not a failure. It is a system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. But something begins to change when you enter what Jung might call a stage of inner development, where the psyche accumulates enough awareness to begin resisting its own automatic patterns. Not through effort, not through willpower, but through recognition. The old behaviors stop feeling like relief. They begin to feel like something else, something outdated, something that once protected you, but no longer serves you in the same way. And this is where the confusion begins. Because from the outside, and sometimes even from your own perspective, this shift looks like withdrawal. It looks like you're becoming less available, less warm, less engaged. People may say you have changed, and they are right. But what they often cannot see is that what has changed is not your capacity to love. It is your relationship to the role you once played inside love. There is a particular kind of loneliness that emerges here, and it is not the loneliness of being abandoned. It is the loneliness of no longer abandoning yourself. It appears in ordinary moments. Someone close to you is struggling, and you feel the familiar pull to move toward them, to take responsibility, to fix, to carry. But you do not move in the same way, not because you do not care, but because something inside you has gained enough weight to remain where it is. And in that space between the impulse and the action, something new begins to form, a self that is not defined by constant responsiveness. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming distinct from the unconscious patterns that shaped you, not separate in a cold or isolated way, but differentiated, able to remain in contact with others without dissolving into them. For someone shaped by early emotional labor, this distinction is profound. You have learned to feel everything, to read a room instantly, to sense what others need before they say it. But what you have not yet learned, because the environment did not require it, is how to feel without becoming responsible, how to witness without absorbing. And this difference changes everything. Much of what you have carried emotionally did not begin with you. It moved through the relational systems you were part of. Feelings that others could not process were expressed indirectly, and you, being receptive, became the place where they settled. Anxiety, disappointment, grief, unspoken tension. You took these in, often without realizing it, and experienced them as your own. This is not imagination. It is the mechanism of projection operating unconsciously. What cannot be held by one person is placed into another, and the receiving person processes it as though it originated within them. You may recognize this in a subtle but familiar experience. A conversation that appears neutral on the surface leaves you feeling depleted, not tired in the usual sense, but drained in a way that is difficult to explain, as though something has been taken from you, and in a way, something has. Emotional material moved through the interaction and entered your system, and your system, trained to receive, did what it has always done. It absorbed, it processed, it carried. This dynamic continues not because anyone intends harm, but because it serves a function. The other person gains relief. And you gain something that has long been associated with love. The feeling of being needed. This is where repetition begins. Not just repeating relationships, but repeating roles. Because the role itself is where the deepest familiarity lives. Even when it is exhausting, even when it costs you, it feels like home. And so you find yourself again and again in positions where you are the one who holds, the one who understands, the one who stabilizes. And in doing so, you receive something real, something important, a sense of centrality, of importance, of being the one who matters. But that sense comes with a condition. It is tied to what you provide, not simply to who you are. And this is the structure that begins to dissolve when you change. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but gradually. The same interactions that once felt like connection begin to feel heavy. The same roles begin to feel limiting. And what replaces them at first is not clarity. It is disorientation, a quiet that does not yet feel like peace. Because the nervous system is adjusting to a different way of existing, one that does not require constant scanning, constant responsiveness, constant adaptation. The energy that was once directed outward begins to return inward. And that return can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, because it is not how you learn to exist. What begins to surface more clearly in this stage is something Jung described as the emergence of the shadow, not as something new, but as something that has always been present, waiting for the conditions in which it could finally be seen. The shadow, in your case, does not appear first as aggression or destruction. It appears as a quiet but undeniable resistance, a resistance to continuing to play a role that once defined your place in the world. And because that role was built around care, around attunement, around emotional availability, the resistance can be easily misunderstood by others and by you as coldness. But what is actually happening is something far more precise. The parts of you that could not exist within that role are beginning to return. Anger, for example, not the small irritation you learned to express safely, but the deeper structural anger that was never allowed into consciousness. The anger of being needed before being known. The anger of having your interior life bypassed in favor of someone else's. This anger was not absent. It was simply pushed into the shadow because expressing it would have threatened the belonging that depended on your compliance. And now, as the old structure weakens, that anger begins to move again, not as something destructive, but as information. Alongside it comes something equally unfamiliar, your own need. Not filtered, not adjusted, not translated into something more acceptable, but direct. The simple experience of wanting attention, care, reciprocity, presence. For most of your life, this experience did not appear in its original form. It was processed before it could be felt. You assessed the environment, you measured the impact, you adjusted the expression. And often, you decided not to express it at all. What remains now is a faint signal at first, easily overlooked but persistent. And the more space you give it, the clearer it becomes. You may notice this in small, ordinary decisions. You're choosing how to spend your time, how to respond, how to move forward. And instead of immediately calculating how your choice will affect others, you begin, even briefly, to sense what you actually prefer. Not what is easiest for everyone else, not what creates the least disruption, but what aligns with something internal. At first, this signal is quiet. It competes with years of conditioning, but it is there. And every time you notice it, something strengthens. At the same time, the absence of a fully formed self can become visible. This is one of the most misunderstood phases of the entire process. Because when the old structure dissolves, it does not immediately reveal a complete and defined identity underneath. Instead, it reveals space, a kind of interior openness that does not yet have clear content. And this can feel unsettling, even disappointing. You might expect that beneath all the adaptation, there would be a clear sense of who you are. But what you find instead is something quieter, something that needs time to take shape. This is not a failure of the process. It is the process itself. The self you're becoming is not something that was hidden, fully formed. It is something that emerges through repeated contact with your own experience, through noticing, choosing, feeling, and remaining present, without immediately converting that presence into action for someone else. This is what Jung referred to as the development of the witness, not a detached observer, but a quality of awareness that can remain with what is happening without being consumed by it. As this develops, a new kind of perception becomes available to you. You begin to recognize in real time the difference between what belongs to you and what does not. You are with someone who is carrying something heavy, and you feel it because your sensitivity has not disappeared, but you feel it differently. You feel it as theirs, not as something that must immediately become yours to process. This distinction is subtle, but it is structural. It changes the way you move in every relationship. And because this change is internal, it does not always show up as dramatic behavior. You may still respond, still listen, still care, but the quality of your presence is different. There is a weight to it now, a density. You are not dissolving into the interaction. You are remaining within yourself while also being with the other person. And this, more than anything you say or do, is what others begin to feel. For some people, this shift is destabilizing, not because you have become difficult, but because you're no longer available in the way they were accustomed to. The automatic emotional absorption, the immediate responsiveness, the constant adaptation, these are no longer the default. And for those who relied on that dynamic, the change feels like loss. They may interpret it as distance, as selfishness, as withdrawal. But what they are actually experiencing is the presence of a boundary that did not previously exist. It is important to understand this without turning it into blame. The dynamic you were part of served a function for both sides. It provided them with a place to put what they could not hold, and it provided you with a sense of meaning, of connection, of being necessary. The change disrupts that exchange, and disruption, even when it is healthy, can feel uncomfortable. But the discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something real is shifting. What begins to separate more clearly now is the difference between love and self-betrayal. For a long time, these were intertwined. Caring meant adjusting, absorbing, managing. Love meant being the one who held everything together. But as the process continues, you begin to see that these are not the same thing, that it is possible to care without disappearing, to remain connected without abandoning yourself in the process. This changes the nature of love itself. It becomes more precise, less driven by compulsion, more grounded in presence. You are no longer offering a version of yourself shaped entirely by what the other person needs. You are offering something more real, something that includes your own experience as part of the relationship. And paradoxically, this makes connection more genuine, not less. Because what is present is no longer a role, it is a person. The complexes that once governed your responses do not disappear completely. You may still feel the pull toward someone who needs you. You may still experience the warmth of being necessary, but you're no longer identical with that pull. There is a space between the feeling and the action. And within that space, you can choose. Sometimes you will move toward the other person from genuine care. Sometimes you will remain where you are. Both are possible now. The same is true of your relationship to authority within yourself. The uncertainty that once defined your sense of legitimacy begins to soften, not because you have proven yourself externally, but because you begin to trust your own perception. You begin to recognize that your experience does not need constant validation to be real, that what you feel, what you notice, what you understand has its own validity, and this recognition becomes a foundation. This does not mean the process becomes easy. There will be moments, especially in familiar relationships, where the old patterns return, where you find yourself absorbing, adjusting, carrying, before you realize what is happening. And only afterward do you see it. This is not failure. It is part of the reorganization. The old pathways were built over years. They do not disappear instantly. What changes is the frequency with which you can see them. Over time, the number of moments in which you remain present to yourself increases. The number of moments in which you disappear decreases. And this gradual shift accumulates into something stable, not a fixed identity, but a consistent way of being in relation to yourself and others. What stabilizes first is not confidence, not clarity, not a fully articulated sense of self. It is recognition, the ability to know in the moment what is yours and what is not. And from that recognition, everything else begins to build. Your choices become more aligned. Your relationships become more defined. Your sense of self becomes less dependent on external feedback. And eventually, something else becomes clear. The care you offer does not diminish when it is no longer driven by compulsion. It deepens because it is no longer mixed with the need to secure your own place. It is no longer tied to the unconscious bargain that defined your earlier relationships. It is given freely from a place that is not negotiating for belonging. This is the quiet transformation that changes everything. Not an external shift that can be easily named, but an internal reorganization that alters how you experience connection itself. You are no longer the one who must constantly adjust in order to remain connected. You are the one who can remain present without losing yourself. And from that position, something entirely different becomes possible. Not a life without relationships, but relationships that do not require you to disappear. Not a withdrawal from others, but a way of being with others that includes you fully. And this, more than anything else, is what the process has been moving toward all along.